Hello, I'm Keith Hocton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. We, the most distant peoples who dwell upon this earth, the last of the free, have been shielded until today by our very remoteness and by the obscurity in which it is shrouded in our name. But now the most northerly reaches of Britain lie open to our foe. What men know nothing about is invariably a cause of fascination. There are no peoples who dwell beyond us, nothing but waves and rocks and the Romans, who are more terrible still, for there is no escaping their exactions by submitting to them and baring the neck. Men have stripped the entire world bare. They have exhausted the dry land by plundering all it has to offer. So now they ransack the sea. A wealthy enemy excites that rapacity. A poor one, their hunger for power. The East and West alike have failed to satisfy their appetites. Alone among men, they lust equally after the rich and the poor. What they spaciously call empire is merely robbery, slaughter, and looting. They create a wilderness, and they call it peace. That was Calgacus in AD 83, a British warlord celebrated both for his breeding and for his valor, and he delivered that speech on a mountain called Graupius in the Highlands of Scotland, what was then called by the Romans Caledonia. So last time we had Boudica, and we were talking about how she was the first real great rich character in British history. And here we have the first person in all Scottish history to have a name. So the Caledonians are on the slopes of this mountain, Graupius, and as on so many occasions in subsequent Scottish history, they're resisting a vast invasion from the south. And it's been 40 years since the Romans landed in Kent, and they have now reached the Highlands. And the process of conquest, as we were discussing it last time in our episode on Boudica, has been devastating. So in the Great Battle with Boudica, perhaps 40,000 Britons were slaughtered, and that effectively ends her revolt. We've had genocidal campaigning in Wales, hundreds of thousands of people killed, hundreds of thousands enslaved. So you can see where Calgacus is coming from, and the line in which he ends, that speech I just gave, they create a wilderness and they call it peace, is probably one of the most famous denunciations of imperialism of all time. I mean, it's often quoted, often repeated, and it seems to offer a counterpoint, I think, to the glory that was Rome. It seems to give us the view from the barbarian side, except, of course, it's not actually verbative. It's essentially invented by Tacitus, the great Roman historian, who is absolutely on trend with what Roman historians do. No one would see it as poor form, but he is putting words into this Caledonian leader's mouth. And it appears in the biography of Agricola, who is the governor of Britain, who is leading the legions, the Roman side, at the Battle of Mount Graupius. And when Tacitus gives these words to Calgacus, it's not fantasy. He's extremely well informed on British affairs. Agricola was his father-in-law. He may well have actually served in Britain himself. So to quote Anthony Burley, a very distinguished expert on northern Britain in the Roman period, he says, why not suppose that Tacitus served in Britain in one of the four legions in the army of his father-in-law? And he could well have actually stayed for 2 to 3 years. And he points out very clearly in the accounts of Agricola's governorship that Tacitus writes, the first 3 years in incredible detail. And then it becomes slightly more sketchy, implying that perhaps Tacitus was actually present at Britain during the first 3 years, but not after that time. So, in effect, he would have a very good idea of what the Roman conquest meant for Britons. But having said that, I think that Graupius's speech actually tells us less about British attitudes to Roman imperialism and probably more about Tacitus's own. And it's obvious. I mean, no man who is capable of composing that speech that I read out at the beginning of this podcast can possibly be reckoned to view empire and conquest as unambiguous good. So I guess the question then is, does this mean basically that he's woke? Is he a woke historian, Roman historian, part of this woke mind virus? So we'll see. We will see over the course of this episode where Tacitus is coming from. And isn't that interesting? You know, the idea that the germ of this criticism of Roman imperialism and imperialism generally is right there at the beginning with Roman culture itself. The question is, are the reasons that Tacitus is criticizing imperialism the reasons that we today might criticize imperialism? And that's something that we can explore, I think, over the course of this particular episode. So let's get into the British context. A generation has gone by since the arrival of the Romans in southern Britain. So that speech is in AD 83. We've had Boudicca's revolt, and after that, the sheer punitiveness, that's the bloodthirstiness of the Roman response to that, which is the destruction of a great mass of people that followed Boudicca. And of course, this sends a very clear signal that the Romans are here for good. They're not going to withdraw. And of course, there was that issue that I pointed out last time in episode 3, that the guy who actually pushed the repression was later recalled because people in Rome actually felt that he had gone way too far. So that leads to the question of, how did the Romans actually view Britain? Tacitus is not alone in feeling that the early decades of the Roman occupation have been pretty badly mismanaged, and effectively that Boudicca's revolt is an expression of that. And of course, the aftermath of Boudicca's revolt, firstly, it's now impossible for the Romans even to contemplate withdrawal. Way too much blood has been lost, too much gold has been invested. It would be too great a humiliation. So they're in for the long haul, but at the same time, I think there is a recognition that they need to up their game. The repression has gone way too far. There's a guilt that is kind of an acknowledgement, if you like, that Boudicca was mistreated. There's an anxiety that Paulinus, in his reprisals in the wake of the suppression of Boudicca's rebellion, he's kind of creating a desert and calling it a wilderness and calling it peace. And the man who applies this perspective in the wake of Boudicca's revolt is the new procurator. So the guy who's in charge of the finances of the province, and this is a man called Gnaeus Julius Alpinus Classicanus. And the Alpinus in his name actually points to the fact that he's from the south end of Gaul, in the region of the Alps. So maybe that Gaelic background suggests why he might feel a little bit more sympathetic towards the Britons, because he saw what happened to his own people. Keep in mind, when Caesar took Gaul, he killed over 1 million and he enslaved 1 million more. So Alpinus writes back to Rome, he writes to Nero, and he says, this is all going too far. It's counterproductive to what you want to do. You need to replace Suetonius Paulinus, even though he's that great general. So Nero sends a freed man, a man called Polyclitus, on a kind of fact-finding mission, if you like. Tacitus, I think, is very withering about the scale of the size of the mission, but he obviously does a very good job because he reports back and says, yes, we actually do need a new leader here. And so some ships are lost, and so they use this as an excuse to withdraw him and bring him back to Rome. And the new governor is the nephew of Plautus, who was the original invader, the general at the head of the invasion force, the first governor of Britain, and his nephew is a man called Petronius Petilianus. And he works very hard at healing the wounds and trying to repair the damage that's been done in the wake of the Boudicca massacre. And he doesn't engage in fresh conquests. So no further wars under his governorship. And already London has become the financial centre. London has been obliterated by Boudica. Classiacanus clearly devotes himself to rebuilding it because you can recognize that it's essentially the natural place from which to administer the finances of Britain. And when he dies in due course in 65, he's given this sumptuous funerary monument in the East End, or what would become the East End. So beyond the eastern flank of the City Road as the road leads out, the East End leading out of London. And we know this because it was subsequently used as part of the medieval wall and found in excavations. And the original is actually in the British Museum. And there's a replica of it by Tower Hill Tube Station. So you can actually go and see it if you're passing Tower Hill Tube Station on the way to the Tower of London. Poor Topiolanus comes to a much stickier end. So he actually goes back to Rome in 63 and is greeted with great honor by Nero and is generally felt to have done a pretty good job. So in 68, when rebellion breaks out across the empire against Nero, Nero turns to Topiolanus and puts him in charge of the defense of Italy. Nero then commits suicide in AD 69, and that sees a host of emperors, 4 in total. And I did cover this in another episode, one succeeding another. And Topiolanus gets put to death by the first of these emperors, a man called Galba. But Galba doesn't actually last very long. His successor also doesn't last very long. His successor doesn't last very long, and then you get to the last of the 4, which is Vespasian, coming to power. And if you remember, he was actually in command of the 2nd Legion in the original invasion back in AD 43. And look, he does know Britain, and he pacifies the empire and manages to put it back on its feet. But this year, in AD 69, the year of the 4 emperors, has been turbulent for Britain. There are numerous mutinies. There are different legionary commanders backing different emperors. One of the legions is completely withdrawn. And what had originally been a garrison of 4 legions in Britain now consists only of 3. And this in turn encourages an uprising against Rome in the kingdom of the Brigantes, which again, I talked about before. It's essentially what we now call Northern England, ruled by this extraordinary queen called Cartimandua, who's been consistently pro-Roman all the way through. Remember, she was the one who actually handed over Craticus, the great original freedom fighter in Britain, to the Romans. And she has this extraordinary stronghold in North Yorkshire in a place called Stanwick. Very formidable, great ramparts, 4 miles long in length, with lots of very high quality Roman goods. So Cartimandua is living her best life. She's having this incredible time. Everything's great, but she does have problems with her erstwhile husband, a man called Ventius. And 10 years previously, they'd had a massive argument and they broke up. Effectively, she kicked him out and he had then gone to war with her. The Romans had come to her rescue, but Ventius is still kind of lurking there in the background, in the margins, keen to make his comeback. And he's all the more aggravated because Cartimandua has massively sassed him by having an affair with his armor bearer, a man called Velicatus. Ventuus is furious and he takes full advantage of the turmoil in AD 69, the 4 emperor turmoil, to have another crack at Cartimandua to try and finish her off, if you like. So Cartimandua again appeals for help, and she's rescued just in the nick of time by the new governor who's been sent out by Vitellius, who's the 3rd of the emperors in that 4-year reign of emperors. And this is a man called Vettius Ballinus, who is actually very, very effective. And he's so effective, Vespasian is actually happy to keep Benalis in that position. And you would have to guess that the reason for that is because he rates Benalis very highly. And it doesn't actually matter that Benalis was appointed by Vitellius, because what really matters to Vespasian is that Britain is properly sorted out. So it's under Benalis that the north is actually pacified. And we know this because the poet Statius actually says at this point, he reached his Caledonian fields. And that then led me to wonder if Benalis was the first recorded Roman to travel to Caledonia, to Scotland. But probably not. So this is probably poetic exaggeration on his behalf. Probably what he is doing is sending diplomatic missions up to Caledonia, so beyond what is now northern England into the lowlands. And the aim is clearly to try and set up friendly relations with the people who live up there. And he clearly does a good job, because when he goes back in 71, Vespasian gives him patrician rank, which is very high honor indeed. So he's obviously done very well for himself. And I think the fact that Benalis is putting out feelers north, beyond even Brigantia, into what would now be Scotland, reflects the fact that Vespasian wants to see the whole of Britain conquered. Vespasian himself has served there. His son, Titus, who in due course will become emperor himself, has served there as well. They're the Flavian dynasty. And I think they see it as a mission that they've been given by the gods to conquer Britain in its entirety. And there is one further person who is part of the Flavian kind of family dynastic, setup, who's been engaged in Britain. And this is our old friend Carialis, who was the commander of the 9th Legion that has been mauled by the Iceni and the Trinovantes when he was fast marching to try and relieve Colchester just after Boudicca had burned it to the ground. So he's the son-in-law of Vespasian. So he's married Vespasian's daughter. And when Benalis is called back, Vespasian sends Carialis as the new governor. And you kind of might think this is a weird choice, considering that he notoriously was defeated by Boudicca. But I think Vespasian values him not because he's obviously very loyal, not because he's part of the family, but because he's very energetic, he's very bold, and he's not the kind of man that will lounge around in his tent all day. Carialis has actually proved his worth and pacified a large revolt in Batavia, and he now comes to Britain. And it's an indication of how determined Vespasian is to see Britain conquered, that when Carialis comes to Britain, he does so with an entire legion, 5,000 men. So the strength of the island's garrison is finally restored from 3 to 4. So it's all go. So up north he goes in 71. And that's the year that he arrives. He goes up past the Midlands. He goes up north of the Humber. He goes to the River Ouse, and he's heading towards the place that we now call York. And previously, the most northerly base was Lincoln. He now wants to push further forwards and see the site of York, or Ebba Arkham, as the Romans called it, the place of yew trees. And it's strategically a very good one because it's on the obvious route for marching northwards, the Great Northern Road, as it will come to be called. And it can also be supplied by sea up the Humber. And so this becomes the new base for the embattled 9th Legion. So it moves from Lincoln to York, and this becomes the obvious launch pad for further expansion northwards. So over the term of Carialis' governorship, there are clearly repeated battles on both sides of the Pennines, the Great Spine northwards. And by 72, you have a fort being established in what will become Carlisle. So almost on the very doorstep of what today is Scotland. And in 74, Carialis is replaced by a very, very impressive man called Frontinus, who wrote a number of works that actually survived. He was clearly a very proficient engineer, and he actually wrote an excellent book on aqueducts, which is our main source of how aqueducts actually functioned. And he was a huge inspiration to Robert Harris, who wrote a book about Pompeii. And in Frontius's book on aqueducts, it was a massive source for Robert Harris when he was writing that, because he talked a lot about how you repair the leaks in aqueducts, which is one of the very strong themes that actually runs throughout that particular novel. So he's obviously very much a military man, and he wrote a book on military strategy. games through the ages. And in doing that, he could boast a very formidable track record because he's setting out to absolutely pacify two upland areas that are on the doorstep of the lowlands, which is Brigantia and, of course, Wales. So Brigantia has pretty much been pacified by 77, except perhaps in the Lake District. We know that Helvenium and all that was very difficult to sort out. So people who have actually been to the Lake District and visited the Roman fort at Hardknott that's built, several decades later, it's a sign that it's the one region of northern England that remains difficult for the Romans to pin down. And of course, you'll know if you've listened to the other episodes that Wales has been a constant source of stress for successive governors and Frontinus. But you know what? He's doing his bit, and he's founded two massive new legionary fortresses, one at Kellyanne and one at Chester. And the Roman remains in those two sites are still very, very impressive even to this day. He's also building more forts across Wales. And the reason why I think Frontinus is partly interested in seeing Wales pacified is because he's an engineer and he's interested in all the mineral wealth that Wales has to offer, all the gold, the silver, the lead, and so on. And so he's obviously determined to secure them on behalf of Rome. My sense was that Britain was always a complete backwater in the Roman Empire. And basically, a posting there, if you got one, was a demotion. But I was actually wrong, because actually some of the people who have been sent to run Britain are absolutely tip-top Roman commanders. And I think there's a sense that Britain is the most challenging province to administer. And just maybe the best people are sent there because you can get rich there, but you have to work for it. Britain is where you send your most competent people, guys that you can actually trust to do a good job. And that reflects in the fact that in Britain, a governor needs to be very proficient at war. There's a lot of fighting to do, but he also has to be a very good civil administrator. And that's where Paulinus fell down. He was an absolutely brilliant general, but he was absolutely hopeless at pacifying territories that had been conquered and introducing them to civilization as the Romans would define it. So by the 70s, you have the war zone in the north. This is targeted for conquest. But by this period, the lowlands in the south are actually starting to recover from the depredations of the conquest of Boudicca's rebellion. And this matters because you can't essentially fund the campaigns that have to be launched without extracting a bit of wealth from the lowland provinces. You need that. So that's why I think in 77, when Frontinus is recalled by Vespasian, he sends as the new governor a man who really couldn't be better qualified for the job. And this is a man called Gnaeus Julius Agricola. I've mentioned him before at various points over these 4 podcasts. But just to give you a bit more background on him, he comes from a very long line of Roman citizens in Gaul. He has been a student in Massilia, which is present-day Marseille. So that was also home to Pythias. And I think that perhaps actually fostered a very early interest in the northern reaches of the ocean. He's very experienced in British affairs. And I've already mentioned that he served under Paulinus during the Boudiccan revolt. And he served with him in Wales when they put down the Druids. And he's commanded a legion both under Benalis and Carialis. And of course, he had then been given command experiences as governor by Vespasian in Aquitaine in Gaul. Essentially, he has every attribute and level of experience that Vespasian would want in a man charged with the ultimate conquest of the entire island. And so it's Agricola who is now in a position to solve all kinds of mysteries that Pythias had hinted at. And of course, subsequent geographers had actually asked the question, is Britain an island? They didn't know at this stage. And if it is, what actually lies beyond Britain? Can the whole of the landmass be brought under Roman rule? And what about Ireland? The other great island just across the sea. And it's Agricola's mission clearly to provide answers to all of these questions. And it's a measure of how challenging this mission is, but I think also how effective he is. He will end up serving a term as governor for 7 years, which is unprecedented. And during his time, Britain witnesses seismic changes. So Gnaeus Julius Agricola arrives in Britain in the year 77. And I'd like you to come back after the break to find out what happens next. Really, you can't miss it. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. The Britons readily submit to military service, the payment of tribute and the other obligations imposed by our imperial administration, provided that there is no abuse. This they bitterly resent, for they're broken into obedience, but not as yet to slavery. So that was Tacitus, the great Roman historian, in his biography, The Agricola, the man who we introduced at the end of this first half. And Tacitus wrote that in about 98, AD 98. It's a great story of eulogy to his father-in-law and a portrait of Agricola as the ideal Roman governor. So brilliant at the arts of war, but also the arts of peace and civil administration and so on. But it's darker and I think also a little bit more subtle than that. A portrayal of empire itself as a kind of poison. The passage that I opened the episode with, the description of empire as a kind of spacious form of robbery and plunder and rape, and, the Romans create a wilderness and they call it peace. This is in the Agricola. Tacitus is writing it. And well, we'll see what he means by it and what his perspective on empire actually is. But I think it's clear as well that he hugely admires his father-in-law. And I think, as well he should. There is inevitably some revisionism about Agricola's record. There's surprisingly few inscriptions that bolster, what Tacitus claims for him. But the evidence, I think, is very clear. He's a very, very formidable figure. But before he launches his campaign into Caledonia, he first has to finish off this running, weeping sore that has been Wales for so many years. And because he's actually served with Paulinus there, both in the highlands of northern Wales and also in the attack on Anglesey on the Druids, he actually has good sense of what it would take to actually finish that campaign off. So according to Tacitus, he attacks the Order Vigians, who are the tribal grouping in the north of Wales, directly up in their mountain hideouts, leading his men from the front. Tacitus writes he cuts to pieces almost the entire fighting force of the tribe. Having done that, he then attacks Anglesey again, finishing off the job that Paulinus had been distracted from doing by the news of the Boudiccan revolt. He doesn't have boats on this occasion, but what he has are the ninjas of their time, the large Batavians who strap on their armor, jump into the sea, and wade across it. And of course, it's curtains for all resistance on Anglesey. And it's the measure of the renown and the mystique that this ancient stronghold of the Druids has on Rome that this is greeted with great enthusiasm back in the capital. And there's actually a coin minted showing a hooded figure from Anglesey kneeling down on the ground and accepting defeat. So a druid, if you like, kneeling in front of a conquering Roman. And this is actually the last mention that we get in the classical texts of campaigning in Wales. So from this point, we can basically assume that Wales has been pacified. The Druids have finally been obliterated. And I think, interestingly, the way that it's done is a bit like the way Edward I, 1,000 years later, will actually pacify Wales. He does it by building forts, strongholds, places that essentially can kind of act like fetters thrown across the landscape. So the gap between Roman forts in Wales are rarely more than 15 miles apart. The main corridors of movement between them are all very, very tightly controlled. To quote David Mattingly's new book, An Imperial Possession, the Roman deployment was designed in part to control the spaces between the major British peoples rather than simply occupying their heartlands. By segregating people and supervising contact between them, Rome applies the principle of divide and rule, and those forts remain occupied up until about the 160s. So essentially, Agricola finishes that job off, and that means that he's now set for expansion further north. But I've also mentioned to you how it's important that a governor be effective as a campaigner, but he also has to heal the wounds in the lowlands, and he has to kind of fatten the sheep up ready to be fleeced, if you like. And I think that because he had lived through the Boudiccan revolt, he's actually very alert to the feelings of injustices that the rebels had felt. And so, I mean, again, if we can rely on Tacitus, and I see no reason not to, he makes a point of ironing out kind of palatable injustices. So Tacitus says that he never showed favoritism to his opponents. The best, he was sure to best justify his trust. So he's keen to have people who are honest, people who can be trusted, and not to go around whipping and raping, British figures after they've been conquered. So Tacitus tells us that Agricola encourages the elites of Britain to learn Latin, to wear the toga, to enjoy fine dining. And, this is actually the classic approach that the British in India will adopt, encouraging leading figures in India to speak English, to play cricket, to play polo. And it's not coincidental because, of course, all the British administrators, future British administrators, have actually read the Agricola. So there is a direct influence of that particular book. And what Agricola is doing, he's encouraging the process of urbanization because the Romans need cities if they're going to make the provinces pay. So London is actually a classic example of a boomtown. And with Classiacanus' sponsorship, it's already started to recover from Boudica burning the town to the ground. So in AD 65, we have the earliest known mention of London's name, and it appears on one of the Bloomberg tablet documents that I mentioned that were found in the Walbrook. But even before Agricola arrives, the forum and an amphitheater has been constructed, and by the time that Agricola is there, it's already become the largest city in Britain. And it's well on its way to becoming the imperial city, although Colchester holds that position till the early 2nd century. And I think its wealth is tribute to the economic benefits that Britain's integration into the empire brings, because the combination of a unitary state at peace in southern Britain combined with access to markets on the continent means that London is almost invariably going to boom. It's the obvious nodal point within Britain, and its docks mean that ships from Gaul can come there easily. So its growth is actually very unsurprising. And there's one other urban centre that seems to grow just as organically and naturally under Agricola, and this is Aquasulis, which of course becomes Bath. And the reason for that is that it has hot springs. And so it's a perfect place for baths, and a perfect place for Romans and Britons to go and relax, so that city also grows incredibly well. But the thing about other urban settlements in Britain is that they're pretty all artificial. And they're artificial in the same way that McDonald's in, an American camp in Afghanistan is artificial. It's the kind of place that if the Romans weren't there, they wouldn't last. And that's one of the reasons why, looking way ahead, when Roman rule eventually collapses in Britain, those towns go to rack and ruin very, very quickly. So in other words, their foundations are very shallow from the very beginning. Because as I said, looking ahead, and I'm looking 3 centuries ahead, during that time, they don't put down deep enough roots to survive once the colonial power has gone. And I think that's why Tacitus actually brings up Agricola so strongly. Tacitus actually says of Agricola that he gave private encouragement and official assistance to the building of temples, public squares, and good houses, because it wouldn't happen without Roman encouragement. And of course, at this stage, I haven't actually talked about how many Romans there actually are in Britain. And of course, people don't move to Britain in great numbers. I think merchants might, if they're suppliers, say, to the military. And of course, we did see lots of veterans settling at Colchester, but that didn't work out so well. But veterans do continue to do that in the various cities. But I don't think people are sitting there in Spain or southern France and saying, I'd like to move to Britain. And the reason for that is that Britain actually remains despised by the Romans, certainly the Roman ruling classes, right up until the end. So even in the late 4th century, you have poets in Gaul who just find it hilarious, the idea that you might actually have a poet in Britain like Cicero had been. I mean, nothing has really changed. And I think the sense of Britain as a frontier state, it endures. So there's a guy called Stuart Laycock who wrote a book called Britannia Failed State, and then another book on Roman Britain, and I can't remember what that one was called. But he essentially argues that the tribal groupings assist in a much stronger way than people have thought, and that the foundations of Roman rule are actually incredibly shallow because of that. But equally, Britain will always be heavily garrisoned, and so that means as long as there are successful armies there are opportunities for classical Mediterranean civilization to be planted there. And that really matters because, just to reiterate, you need these urban centers if you're going to have a proper taxation system. And proper taxation systems are crucial to the successful functioning of the province. And of course, you can't have a taxation system, in Roman opinion, without a census. So we know from the New Testament, and it's why the story of the Holy Family going to Bethlehem is kind of faintly credible. And wherever the Romans go, they hold a census. So Agricola, we're told by Tacitus, does this. Records are compiled and they're stored in London, which has already become the financial capital. And by the standards of a pre-modern system, I think this is absolutely amazing. I mean, it's a very sophisticated framework for extorting money out of conquered peoples, and it provides a kind of template for subsequent imperial systems. And I think also it establishes a template as well for Agricola's term in office. So in the winter, he operates on building baths, sorting out taxes, and in the summer, he goes off to war and continues conquering. So this is the great project for which he is best known, the mission that Vespasian has given him, which is the conquest of Caledonia. The Flavian dynasty see this as a mission from the gods. Of course, Vespasian dies in 79 and is succeeded by his son Titus. And Titus, I think, is a little bit like any new emperor, like Claudius, right at the beginning of this podcast series. He needs the boost of Congress to give him legitimacy, and so that presumably lies behind Agricola's enterprise. And by 80, so that's the second year of Titus's rule when he inaugurates the Colosseum back in Rome, one of the beasts that is featured in the inaugural games is a bear from Caledonia. There's actually a criminal who's crucified, and the bear is actually encouraged to then devour his intestines. And this is all very exciting to the Romans. And the very fact that you have a bear from Caledonia imprisoned within the Roman arena symbolically, I think, is an allusion to the Roman people that it's not just the beasts, but the land and the people that live on the land that they have now been subordinated. And this is seen as an amazing feat because to Roman geographers, Caledonia is the epitome of barbarism. They actually describe it as one continual forest, which of course it isn't, but by casting it as a forest, they're essentially saying, it's absolutely the pit. And by contrast, that the people who live there are beyond savage. These are barbarians who are even bigger boned than the Britons in the south. They've got orange hair. Pomponius Mela, who's a geographer writing back in the time of Claudius, he actually describes the inhabitants of Caledonia as being uncouth, more ignorant of what makes for civilization than people anywhere in the world, almost wholly lacking in respect for the gods. And the literal meaning of Caledonia to the Romans is hard men, hard land. And the orange hair, which is amazing, they pick up on the orange hair literally 2,000 years ago. So by 81, which is 4 years into his term of office, Agricola has secured a frontier that is spanning the Clyde in the Forth. So that's basically between Edinburgh and Glasgow now. And it's where the Antonine Wall will actually run in due course. And from here, he's actually in a position to scope out Caledonia to the north, the Highlands, but also Ireland, which you can actually see from the southern tip of Caledonia. And Ireland in Agricola's time is to Britain what Britain was to go back in Julius Caesar's time to be seen from Gaul. And of course, if you remember that episode, merchants in Britain are actually going back to Gaul and reporting to the imperial authorities with regards to what's going on there. So you have merchants, Roman merchants, going to Ireland and reporting back to Agricola. And Agricola has actually established treaties of friendship with various Irish leaders. You actually have an Irish king who's been thrown out, who takes refuge with Agricola, and he asks him to intervene. So this is very, very familiar from both the time of Julius Caesar and Claudius. These are all the opportunities that the Romans actually need to launch an invasion. In fact, according to Tacitus, Agricola was very, very tempted. So Tacitus writes, "I've often heard Agricola say that Ireland could be reduced and held by a single legion with a fair-sized force of auxiliaries, and that it would be easier to hold Britain if it were completely surrounded by Roman armies, so that liberty was banished from its site." Fortunately for the Irish, Agricola decides that he doesn't have time because his focus is on Caledonia. And that's what Titus back in Rome wants him to do. And so Ireland is effectively left alone. And in 81, when Titus dies and is succeeded by his brother Domitian, and Domitian, unlike Titus, has not served in Britain and in fact hasn't served in a military context anywhere. So he actually has even more reason to want a great military victory that he can trumpet in Rome. And so this means that essentially Agricola just has to get on with the job. He wants all of Britain conquered. And so this is what Agricola sets out to do. And he pursues a two-pronged strategy, by land and by sea. So by land, advancing along the lowland strip on the eastern flank of Scotland, so effectively leaving the highlands, the mountainous regions, well alone, and he doesn't even attempt to go into them. And he reaches almost all the way up the Murray Forth, in fact, as far as Culloden. And I then wondered, well, what did he find? And of course, obviously, there's much that we can't know because there aren't very many written sources other than Tacitus. But I think what he finds in Scotland is pretty similar to what he finds in Wales or Northern England. Village settlements, people painted blue, all that kind of stuff. Or did he? Was it really that different? So let me read you what Ronald Hutton in his book Pagan Britain has to say on this. So this is a description of Britain in the late Iron Age, just before the Roman invasion. And he says that the southeast itself, very Romanized, they're drinking wine and all this kind of stuff. But then he says the northern and the west of this area, so effectively he's talking about the Midlands, heading towards Yorkshire, had smaller settlements and farmsteads, numerous enclosures, and a greater emphasis on pastoral farming. So the rest of the island, and that would obviously include Wales, and it would certainly include Caledonia, he says that it exhibited much more continuity with the early Iron Age, meaning that it lacked Roman luxury goods. It lacked coins, it lacked anything from the continent. And it also lacked, he says, large central places of assembly. So political units, when Agricola actually gets to Caledonia, Are there tribal strongholds? Are there warlords? And the answer is no. There are just homesteads and fortified enclosures on a much, much smaller scale. So therefore, on one level, I guess it's easier to conquer, I suppose, but on another level, it's kind of impossible because you can't pin them all down. There's no central authority, there's no capital, there's no king of Caledonia, nothing that you can capture to effectively end a war of conquer. But you can also be lulled by this, I suppose, into thinking that, the Caledonians are like midges. They're kind of annoying, but they can't ultimately do you that much damage. Of course, there is always the risk that if you go crashing up there with your legions, it will actually encourage people who previously had been isolated and desperate to gather together to try and form a kind of guerrilla army that can then attack the invaders. And this is actually what happens in 82. So this is in the 6th year of Agricola's term of office as governor, when the Caledonians launched a cohesive night attack against the hapless 9th Legion, who are always being mauled. But I don't think they're being mauled because they're useless. They're just being mauled because they're always the legion that seems to be the furthest north. So on this particular night, they are taken by surprise. The camp is almost overrun, except that Agricola is able to come and reinforce them. And Agricola actually turns it to his own end by saying to them after the battle that, look, you guys have been given a bloody nose, but that's all. We've got to get on with this, and we've got to take revenge for that. We can't let this happen again. And the 9th and all the other legions that are there cheer and say, yep, let's go and do it. Let's get to the end of the world and wipe these barbarians out. And according to Tacitus, this is how Agricola gets his men in sharing the dream of conquering the whole of Britain. So, yes, it's a challenge. There's no question about it. But Agricola has his instructions. So the building of infrastructure, roads, forts, it's worked in Wales. There's no obvious reason why it won't work in Scotland. And there is also an additional factor, which is that Agricola has a fleet. And this is central to his whole plan because it means that his army can actually be supplied by sea, and also the fleet can be used to kind of ferry small groups of legionnaires, up and down to wherever they're needed. So if there's a stronghold, like on an isolated promontory or something like that, soldiers can actually be taken there. And of course, for the Romans, they're actually used to much calmer seas. And the North Sea off Scotland, the Scottish coast, can be very, very unforgiving and very, very frightening. And Tacitus actually describes how soldiers and the sailors, when they meet up, compete with each other by saying, what's the most dangerous, situation you've been in? Was it the breakers, off the Caledonian rocks? Was it the breakers off the First of Forth? And they compete with their stories. And Tacitus also reports that Britons themselves, so the people in Caledonia, are much more intimidated by the fleet than they are by a large Roman army. So he writes, the Britons, for their part, we learned from prisoners, were dismayed by the appearance of the fleet. Now that the places on their seas were opened up, they felt their last refuge in defeat was closed against them. So by 88, Agricola is ready for what he hopes will be the final push by both land and by sea. So, repeatedly confronted by Roman steel, the Caledonians had melted away into the bogs and the woods as insubstantial. So it seemed to the frustrated invaders. But now at last they were brought to battle. And this, listeners, is Mons Graupius. We don't know exactly where this is because Tacitus doesn't say, but we think it's probably in the vicinity of where Aberdeen is, or certainly within that area, where Calgacus gives us his great talk that I opened with at the beginning of this episode. We also think that his name originates from ancient Celtic and means something like the armor or the sword man or the armor keeper, but we don't exactly know. What we do know is that at last, Agricola has managed to encourage the Caledonians to form a kind of coherent army with chariots and everything. And he's done this essentially by kind of raiding the length of the coastline so that the Caledonians feel that they've got no choice but to try and see the invader off in a large pitched battle. And they assemble on the foothills of Mons Graupius. There's lots of yelling, there would have been chanting, there would have been cheering, that kind of thing, with hundreds of chariots kind of zipping up and down. And then the next day, the battle is joined. And it's actually the Batavians, these German auxiliaries that have been a feature of this conquest right from the very beginning, who take the lead against the enemy. And it's then the cavalry that finishes them off, and then the legions essentially wade in and cut them to pieces. And the next day, at dawn, Agricola sends horsemen out to reconnoiter the facility to see if any fighting still needs to be done, and there isn't. So Tacitus writes in kind of chilling terms, the silence of desolation reigned on all sides. The hills were abandoned, distant homesteads had been put to the torch, not a soul was to be seen by our scouts. And the estimate of the casualties? Between 15 and 20,000 men. I mean, a real massacre again. So Agricola assumes that this is it. This is the great battle that he's been looking for, and he takes hostages, and then he heads south for the winter. But he leaves his men in situ north of the Firth of Forth for the first time. And they're commissioned to build more forts, to construct more roads, to absolutely nail down this occupation. And at the foot of a glen beside the River Tay, a place now called Inchtut Hill, they built the most northerly legionary base ever constructed, and it houses some 5,000 men. Today, there's nothing really there to be seen except for the ridges, because it's all now covered in grass. There's nothing really there to see now except for ridges, because it's all covered in grass. It really hasn't kind of been maintained, but it's actually the best preserved legionary fortress anywhere to be seen in the entire Roman Empire. It's an amazing place to go and wander around. And what you get is a real sense of the ghosts that are there. And of course, it's built to be the headquarters of a permanent occupation force. So it's an amazing place. Meanwhile, the Roman fleet continues to head northwards, and the aim is actually to demonstrate that Britain is indeed an island. So there's a sense that you've got this conquered land, and now you're conquering the ocean as well, which had always been seen by the Romans as a dimension of the supernatural. But now Agricola is all out. So they head north of Scotland, they get to see Orkney, they see the land there, they conquer it, they subdue it. They even glimpse Shetland, which Agricola said, don't go and attack that because it's too far. But effectively, we have glimpsed Ultima Thule. I mean, it's an amazing feat of conquest over 2,000 years ago. And they actually then complete their circumnavigation of Caledonia, and they demonstrate that indeed Britain is an island. And back in Rome, this is actually kind of space race stuff. This is like landing on the moon, and it's greeted with great enthusiasm, more so actually than the victory at Mons Graupius. And the poets are all over it, and they say, the furthest limits of the world have surrendered, around which the ebbing flood tides roar. I mean, great stuff. And of course, they're not wrong. I mean, these are people whose frontier is on the Euphrates or, in the Sahara. To go as far as they've gone northwards is an extraordinary feat. So Agricola can now write to Domitian and say, mission completed. The entire island is now peaceful. It's now secure. It's now conquered. So Domitian takes him at his word and calls him back. And Agricola goes back to Rome, and he's given signal honors. He's given a statue in the Forum of Augustus, which is where all the statues of the greatest heroes from Rome's history actually are. So, I mean, this is an amazing honor. And in Britain itself, the completion of the conquest of the island is commemorated by the construction of an enormous four-sided triumphal arch at Richborough. And it's still seen as the kind of gateway to Britain. So rather like the gateway of India in Bombay, Mumbai, the Romans have actually done it. But as I said, this great legionary fortress in the north of Scotland is best preserved. And it's best preserved because it only lasts for 3 years. And then it's completely abandoned, and they never ever go back there. It's literally a ghost town. And the reason for this is that there's a massive crisis in the Balkans. People there called the Dacians, who are a very menacing military presence beyond the Danube, have crossed into the Balkans, and Domitian needs to staunch this gap in the frontier, so he summons one of the 4 legions from Britain, and it just happens to be the one from Caledonia. Caledonia is a great trophy, of course, but it's actually not as important as preserving the Roman presence in the Balkans. And that might be fatal to the entire fabric of the empire. So the whole of Caledonia is abandoned. And if you actually go to the National Museum of Scotland, there's this incredible kind of tangled mess of metal nails that's feet and feet high. And these are actually nails that the Romans buried together, that they mangled together, effectively to ensure, when they started leaving the fortress, to ensure that the local tribes wouldn't be able to get hold of it and melt it down and turn it into swords or spearheads. And interestingly, I think at this time, Tacitus is absolutely merciless about this withdrawal. And he actually laments that Britain had no sooner been conquered than it's immediately been given up. And of course, he blames Domitian for this and says that Domitian is actually jealous of Agricola, that he would rather abandon Caledonia than allow Agricola to enjoy his glorious retirement, and that it's all, incredibly unfair. But then if you think about it, folks, what strategically would Caledonia make you want to commit to a full-time fortress there? And of course, I don't want to offend any of my Scottish listeners, but what is there in the 1st century AD that would mean that you would want to commit so many military and financial resources when you have pressing problems on the Danubian frontier, if you like? You would have to ask yourself, what's more important to you? And I think, if truth be told, Domitian took the only possible decision. Tacitus, I have to say, is a great hater. He's a hater on a world scale. And of course, that's not something that you should ever surrender to as a historian. But Tacitus really hates Domitian, and he's always thinking the worst of him, and entirely interprets the withdrawal from Caledonia through the prism of Domitian's personal envy of Agricola. But he also interprets it in another way. And this comes to how Tacitus understands the Roman conquest of Britain, and more generally, the whole project of Roman imperialism. Because as well as blaming Domitian for the abandonment of Caledonia, he also blamed something profounder, which is his notion that the Romans themselves have been sapped by their very greatness, that they've become soft and that they've become flabby. And this is why he gives Calgacus, at the beginning of this podcast, this is why he gives him this amazing speech. Tacitus actually admires the Caledonians, actually for the same reason that most Romans despise them, for their very lack of civilization, because this has prevented them from going soft. They remained the hard men. That's what Caledonians are. And this reminds Tacitus very clearly of the traditional Roman values that he is a huge admirer of, and which he feels have either been lost or are being lost. And when he actually describes how the civilizing of the Britons down in the lowlands happens, he actually sees this as essentially being the same process of corruption that has affected the Romans in the capital. And not only that, across the entire heartlands of empire, the dissipating effects of luxury, if you like. And so again, there's a very famous passage where he describes this, the process of wearing togas and having central heating and all this kind of stuff. And so he writes, so population was gradually led into the demoralizing temptation of arcades, of baths and sumptuous banquets. The unsuspecting Britons spoke of such novelties as civilization, when they were, in fact, only a feature of their enslavement. And this essentially is the wilderness of what Calgacus is talking about. It's not just the idea of, a battlefield covered in bodies cut to pieces by Roman swords. It's also the idea that everything that makes the Britons hardy and tough is being corroded and destroyed by what the Romans are bringing into the island. And so this is why Tacitus is suspicious of empire. It's not for the reasons that we would generally recognize today. So those people are opposed to imperialism. It's not because empires have brought the good life to distant reaches of the world. It's because empire is seen as being murderous in and of itself. But Tacitus is not lamenting that. He's not condemning the Roman Empire for the reasons that we might. So the 40,000 killed in Boudicca's last battle, the 15 to 20,000 killed in Scotland. David Mattingly actually estimates that in the 40-year period since the invasion began, up to 250,000 Britons were killed and an equal number were enslaved. And keep in mind, this is when the population of Britain is estimated only to be about 2 million. That's a quarter of people either killed or enslaved in that period. And that's a terrifying record of conquest. And yet no Roman, including Tacitus, ever expresses regret for that. I mean, quite the opposite, actually, right? They celebrate it. They build massive triumphal arches around it. I think that empire brings wealth and corruption, and that you actually lose the very virtues that made you great by achieving greatness. It's in all empires, the fear that empire brings a kind of moral corruption because you're too rich and too successful. Every British imperial administrator would have been familiar with the Agricola. But there's an even more sinister manifestation of this, which is that Tacitus also writes a book about the Germans, who, of course, don't get conquered. They've held the Romans off, unlike the Britons. And in this book, Tacitus pursues the same theme, that the Germans are heroic and noble, that they have resisted the sapping effects of civilization, and it's this that in the long run will enable them to overcome the Romans. And I actually think this is hugely influential on the way that the Nazis understood the patterns of history and the sapping effects of empire. The thing that I think that's fascinating about Roman history. I mean, look, there's so much that's fascinating about the Romans, but one of the sources of fascination is that it's too influential on how subsequent generations in more recent European history come to see the past and therefore the future. So, ladies and gentlemen, that brings to an end this little series about the makings of Roman Britain. With the end of Agricola's mission and the withdrawal, what becomes the line of Hadrian's Wall? Would it be fair to say, and I know this is ridiculous, oversimplistic generalization, that to some extent the story is now over for the next 300 years? Of course, things do happen in Britain. There are numerous mutinies, there are uprisings, there's lots of these kind of things that go on during that time. But by and large, the story of Rome conquering Britain is now settled until the beginning of the 5th century. But it's also evident from throwaway lines that we read in history and from archaeological evidence that actually great convulsions continue to happen until that time. So the 9th Legion, for instance, which had been repeatedly mentioned throughout this story, it actually vanishes without a trace. And of course, that inspires the famous story, The Eagle of the Ninth by Rosemary Sutcliffe, which I absolutely loved. And there's much debate with regards to what actually happened to the 9th Legion. But the fact is, we don't really know what happened to the 9th Legion. And there is no evidence. And this is actually evidence of how many gaps in the record there actually are. And of course, over the centuries that follow, right the way up to the end of Roman Britain. But I think you would also argue that Britain politically is very significant during that time. Britain has about a tenth of the entire armed Roman forces. And there is also a record by St. Jerome in the 4th century who describes it at that time as a womb of tyrants. And by that, he actually means it's a place that fosters would-be Caesars who were endlessly trying to launch attempts to establish themselves as emperors throughout the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. And of course, these were the Romans who were leading the legions at that time. But that, I think, would actually possibly be another podcast. There is a story to tell there. So although this brings to an end my series on Rome, I don't think it brings an end to Roman Britain. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepotpublishing.com. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for listening in. I'll look forward to talking to you next time.